Inside a mesh bag on Virginia's eastern shore is a gurgling answer to climate change. Scientists submerged oysters in a bed of seagrass, an experiment to see if underwater plants, which naturally absorb carbon dioxide, can protect them. You see, oceans are turning warmer and more acidic, thanks to humans burning fossil fuels. And this is hurting not just oysters, but the bountiful ecosystems around them.
Acidification occurs because the carbon dioxide we're adding to the atmosphere dissolves partly in the ocean and forms a weak acid. Any shell-forming creature has a more difficult job forming its shell in an ocean that's more acidic.
At stake is the destructive impact on marine life and the delicate food chains that sustain the world's fisheries. Take creatures called theropods. These tiny sea snails populate all the world's oceans and are a precious food for salmon and many important fish. But in acidic ocean waters, their shells dissolve. Scientists are studying ocean acidification, often called climate change's evil twin. At the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, Professor Emily Rivest runs experiments on oysters.
When we have that combination of warming and acidification, we see the most dramatic negative effects on the larvae. So they don't form their shell properly and they don't eat as well.
The experiments help aquaculture in the Chesapeake Bay. The massive estuary suffers from coastal acidification caused in part by heavy rains and fertilizer runoff. Michael Congrove owns a commercial oyster hatchery.
Where it becomes really tricky is when we have periods of poor water quality that we're not able to solve with our filtration solutions, and that can really put a dent in our production.
If these steps fail, oyster farmers like Brandon Eanes are at risk. He buys seed from hatcheries to sell for wholesale distribution.
You put them in these tanks and they grow.
Yes, ma'am. They put them in these tanks until they grow, until they're about half an inch. Something big enough that we can put in this bag.
Eanes is skeptical of human-made climate change, but he concedes that something in the past 10 years has shifted.
We have oysters grow in December. That's kind of not normal. They're not growing much, but as it gets warmer, I think, if anything, the calendar's shifted. If climate change is man-made, I would hope that man would be smart enough to stop doing what he's doing to have adverse effects.
At the end of June, a record heat wave had catastrophic effects for shellfish in the Pacific Northwest and Canada. At least 1 billion mussels died, says Elisa Gaiman, a marine ecologist at the Hawkeye Institute. Get used to it, scientists say. And the impacts will go beyond shellfish to marine life critical for tourism.
And I've been to places where the health of the corals is clearly diminished, starting with South Florida, parts of the Mexican Yucatan, much of the Caribbean, certainly parts of the Pacific also.
What can be done? Back to our patch of seagrass.
If you can promote the growth of seagrasses, they might actually benefit and have been shown to benefit, for instance, corals that are growing around them. The real solution is to reduce emissions around the globe.
An enormous problem for global leaders, but it's not stopping Todd Janeski from taking small steps. Janeski, with the Virginia Commonwealth University, is part of a multilateral effort to restore oyster habitat by recycling their own shells.
Those larval oysters grow on that shell and we put it onto restoration projects. We're seeing improvements in water clarity. We're seeing aquatic grasses nearby. By creating the habitat for oysters, what we have is a habitat for other animals as well.
Janeski has demonstrated the process to experts from Europe, Australia, and Asia. He says they are coming to recognize the value of oysters in the global fight against climate change. So, the lowly oyster may not be so lowly after all. Verónica Valderas Iglesias for VOA News, Gloucester Point, Virginia.